As the mid to late Devonian Sarcopterygian fish evolved into the late Devonian tetrapods, the skulls did not need to change much, given that most of the features of the tetrapod skull were already present in the skulls of Sarcopterygian fish. And the earliest amphibians still retained a number of primitive features, like an opening for the notochord to enter the skull, something which was lost after the very first amphibians. The very first amphibians retained a number of skull bones from the ancestral fish, which would be lost in later groups of amphibians. They still retain bones and supports for internal gills. They still possessed grooves on their skull bones for a sensory system for hunting in water, the lateral line system. The skull of the early tetrapods did form the foundation for the skull of later groups, which would include frontal bones, which were larger and fused along the midline, although they still formed a flat skull roof. Large parietal bones, which retained the foramen, which allowed light to reach the pineal organ. A number of bones of the face, including the nasal, lacrimal, and jugal bones. The jugal is referred to as the zygomatic in primates. Teeth, or at least marginal teeth, were kept in premaxillary bones and maxillary bones, although a number of bones in the roof of the mouth could retain teeth and even large fangs, as in earlier fish and in early reptiles. If some of these bones seem unfamiliar, it is because they were lost in later tetrapods and mammals, such as the prefrontal, postfrontal, postorbital, and supratemporal. Many of these bones were lost in modern groups of amphibians as well, and so it is interesting that these early tetrapods had skulls which were in many ways more similar to those of Sarcopterygian fish than later groups of amphibians. Another reason that many of these bones might seem unfamiliar is that mammals have consolidated many small ancestral bones to form single composite bones like the occipital bone, the temporal bone, the sphenoid, etc. And so in these early tetrapods and in modern amphibians today, one sees the components of these composite mammalian bones, but not the entire mammalian bone. In the early tetrapods, there were a series of bones in the occipital region, which developed a condyle and once again lost the opening for the notochord to pass. In the temporal region of the skull, the opercular series was lost. Components of the petrosal portion of the temporal bone, like the opisthodic and the anterior prootic bones, were formed. The palata quadrate was reduced and became the epipterygoid and quadrate bones of the temporal region. The parasphenoid became larger and developed a process on the pterygoid bone. The ethmoid became a single unit, which was ossified.